Friends, our previous lecture was on the form and contents of the Quran. We looked at its overall literary quality, at its division into surahs, and at the division of the surahs into verses. We also spoke a bit about the title of the surahs. We mentioned that almost all editions and translations of the Quran feature the title at the heading of each surah. But there's another element of those headers that we find with the surahs, which is connected to our topic for this lecture. At the header of a surah, we tend to find the title. We might also find the number of verses in that surah. But we also find one word, either Meccan or Medinan. And it's that word which is a starting point for our discussion of the relationship between the Quran and Muhammad's life in this lecture. This practice of noting Meccan or Medinan for surahs reflects a traditional conviction, something incidentally not found in the text of the Quran itself. The surah itself doesn't say it is Meccan or Medinan, but rather Muslim scholars through the centuries have decided that individual surahs were revealed to Muhammad either in the Meccan period of his life, which by tradition is from 610 to 622, or the Medinan period of his prophetic career, not his life, I should say prophetic career, which by tradition is 622 to 632. This conviction that we can place a certain surah either into the Meccan period of his career or Medinan period of his career is what has led Muslim scholars to label surahs in this way. And we could see then that in the process of developing ideas about the Quran, a fundamental aspect or fundamental idea was the intertwining or the linking of the life of the Prophet Muhammad and the Quran. What does this dating imply? Well, it implies at least three things which are interesting to us as academic scholars. First, a notion or a conviction that a surah was revealed all at one place and one time. Now, there are some exceptions. There are cases where Muslim scholars traditionally will say that this surah was Meccan, but there are a few verses which were from the Medinan period, later inserted into this Meccan surah. But as a rule, there's a conviction here that an entire surah was revealed in one place and one time. In fact, there's more than that. There's a conviction that God revealed all of the verses of a certain surah at one time before revealing anything from the surah which would come later or come afterwards. Hope this makes sense. Hope this is clear enough. That is, God proceeded to reveal entire surahs one at a time. We have the notion almost that the surahs could be lined up, almost like a long puzzle with individual pieces, like the puzzle of a train. In fact, you might think of the wagons of a train. The surahs linked to each other, one after another. We find them in a certain order in the text of the Quran, but we could rearrange those wagons of the train and put them in a different order, which would be a chronological order. There are two other implications of this dating which are important to note. First of all, the idea that we can date certain surahs either to the Meccan period of Muhammad's career or the Medinan period when he was preaching in the city of Medina implies that when the surahs were proclaimed, they were perfectly preserved. That is, we don't have layers of editing. That is, it's not that Muhammad proclaimed something and then changed something later and then maybe changed something later, or maybe an editor even after his death edited something. Instead, according to this traditional notion, the proclamations were almost frozen. He spoke something, it was recorded, it was kept word for word, letter for letter in the way he proclaimed it, and never changed. A final implication of this idea of chronology or of dating surahs to Meccan or Medinan periods is that Muhammad is the only author of the Quran, or as a Muslim would put it, God is the only author of the Quran. The Quran has only one author. All of these surahs are assigned then into a certain moment in the Prophet's life, into the life of one man. We don't have an investigation into different possible sources for the Quran. This is a very traditional way of reading the Quran. Many Muslim scholars accept it, and many Western scholars also have accepted it. The difference, of course, would be, whereas Muslim scholars will say God is the author of the Quran, non-Muslim scholars have often said Muhammad is the author of the Quran. Well, let's look at where this idea came from. Where did we get the idea that every surah can be put in a place, in an order, a chronological order, either in the Meccan period or the Medinan period? Early Muslim scholars explain material in the Quran by relating stories which were meant to elaborate on certain turns of phrase or certain references in the Quranic text. These stories are known in Arabic as asbab an-nuzul, which to translate is something like the occasions of revelation of a Quranic verse. Let's give one example. The following story, or an example of an asbab an-nuzul account, occasion of revelation account, is related by a Muslim scholar known as al-Wahidi, who died in the year 1076, and he tells it about Quran 3:18, and in particular about the beginning of this verse, which is Allah, or God, bears witness that there is no God but He. Al-Wahidi tells the following story. When the messenger of God appeared in Medina, two rabbis, that is two Jews, from Syria came to see him. When they saw Medina, one of them said to his companion, "How similar is this city to the city from which will emerge the prophet of the end of times?" When they entered in on the prophet, they recognized him by his attributes and descriptions. They asked, "Are you Muhammad?" "Yes," he answered. They said, "We will ask you about witnessing." Remember witnessing from Quran chapter 3, verse 18? "We will ask you about witnessing. We shall believe in you if you do inform us about it." The messenger of God said, "Do ask me." They said, "Tell us about the greatest witness in Allah's scripture." Allah revealed to his prophet Quran 3:18, which says, "Allah bears witness that there is no God but He." This entire story, in other words, is meant to explain why this verse begins, Allah bears witness. A story is told that gives a backdrop to this verse, according to which two Jews came and asked about witnessing, and Muhammad received revelation, which said, Allah bears witness. What the story also does is it pinpoints or it locates this passage of the Quran at a particular moment of the Prophet's life, when he was in Medina. So it locates this passage as a Medinan passage. Through these sorts of stories, chronology of the Quran was constructed. By the retelling of many such stories for different passages, individual passages were located at a certain moment in the Prophet's life. This has been extremely influential. I've already mentioned this idea that not only are surahs located in Meccan or Medinan periods of the Prophet's life, but they're even identified precisely in a particular order or chronology of revelation. The official Quran, the official Arabic edition of the Quran, which was composed or rather edited and officially promulgated in Cairo in 1924, includes notes at the headers of the surah, which always tell which surah was revealed before this particular surah. Occasionally, editors of the Quran will grant some exceptions, as we've mentioned, and will say there's certain insertions. But generally, there's a conviction that Muslim scholars have that we can line up all of the surahs according to the prophetic tradition or prophetic career of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, Western scholars, too, have generally accepted this idea, with some exceptions. One of the most famous Western scholars who works with this idea of chronology is a German scholar named Angelika Neuwirth. However, she makes this addition to the traditional way of assigning certain moments in the Prophet's life to certain passages of the Quran. She says, we should be skeptical of these stories of asbab an-nuzul, such as the story of the two Jews who visited the Prophet in Medina. But we could find certain literary characteristics which would locate passages of the Quran in a particular moment in the Prophet's life. That is, her conviction is that certain passages have qualities which were typical of the way that Muhammad was proclaiming God's word in Mecca, and other passages reflect a different way or different qualities with which Muhammad would proclaim his revelations in Medina. She says, for example, that the Meccan surahs were, quote, unified and technically sophisticated. And Medinan surahs have other qualities. They seem to be combined codification of loosely composed texts consisting of diverse, often conceptually isolated communications. Other scholars, however, are skeptical of the whole idea of chronology. Here's 3 reasons. First of all, chronology denies the possibility that the text could have been edited and redacted afterwards. And we know that the great majority of texts are not simply composed and sort of frozen as they are, but rather edited afterwards. Now, with religious texts, people often claim that they're perfectly preserved, but very often we can detect from a careful reading different stages or different levels of editing in the text. Second, this idea of chronology seems to involve a certain element of circular reasoning. For example, if we go back to the story of the two Jews who visited Medina, which is connected to Quran 3:18, we can read the story in two ways. We can say, indeed, this story explains the historical moment in which this verse was revealed, or we can say that this verse provoked or inspired this story, which is the right way of reading the text. It could be that assuming that this verse is located in a particular moment of time is circular, because the story which gives that moment of time was itself proclaimed, or rather provoked, by the text itself, by that verse. Finally, sometimes material in the surahs does not match the context which is given to it by this process of dating. And very briefly, we might just mention that some surahs traditionally assigned to the Meccan period, surahs such as 26 or 28, have a lot of material that seems to be connected to the Bible. And this is strange because in the Meccan period, and we'll learn more about this in upcoming lectures, Muhammad should have been preaching in the city of Mecca, which was known as a pagan center, with very few Jews, if any, and very few Christians, if any. Why then is there so much biblical material in these so-called Meccan passages? Accordingly, in this course, we won't rely on this notion of chronology, this notion of a certain surah being Meccan or a certain surah being Medinan. We won't speculate on which passages of the Quran came before or after. Instead, we're going to look at the text as a unity, and we're going to appreciate its qualities as a literary work. This approach is not far, in fact, from a well-known Muslim scholar, Fazlur Rahman, a Pakistani, who in his book Major Themes of the Quran wrote that his method is to look for synthesizing themes in a way that's logical rather than chronological. He adds, even if chronological order could be feasibly reconstructed passage by passage, which I consider a real impossibility, it would only explicate what is germinal in the original master idea. Now, Rahman has theological reasons. He believes the Quran is a divine message to humanity and shouldn't necessarily be limited to a chronological reading. Our reasons are academic. It seems to us that the chronological method of reading the Quran is unstable. On academic terms, we're standing on solid ground only when we take the entire text of the Quran as a unity and not think of certain passages as Meccan and other passages as Medinan.